Hey there, Panthers fans. It's Mike Kay, Panthers beat reporter for the Charlotte Observer. I'm here with Alex Zutlow, and this is the latest edition of the Processing Blue podcast.
Woo!
Nothing's really going on in Charlotte right now, so we're going to have to will ourselves through this podcast. Clearly, I've got a really bad head cold. My head feels like it's being punched like every other moment. But I get to see Alex, so it's all not bad. Alex, how you doing today?
I'm good, man. Hey, I could tell you have a headache because you didn't somehow make your headache you didn't somehow segue that into some Panthers ineptitude phrase. I was really expecting something like, oh, he's getting beat up like Bryce was getting sacked last year or something like that. You're more of the analogy kind of guy, so I'll leave that to you. But I hope you're doing okay, man. I'm worried about you.
Well, I'm doing better than Bryce Young.
There we go. Here we go.
He's back. Let's get into this because the big news is that Shy Tuttle has a foot injury and he's being evaluated.
Mike, I was praying you made that joke. No joke. I was praying you made that joke.
So we hope that Shy Tuttle is okay and will be able to perform. But obviously the bigger news is that Bryce Young, the first overall pick in 2023, that was last year, by the way, has been benched for Andy Dalton, his bridge quarterback, or his supposed bridge quarterback, or should have been bridge quarterback, because that probably would have solved a lot of problems heading into this year. But I'll get into that later, and you want to stay tuned for this because I've got a lot to say about Bryce Young's benching. But I want to give Alex the floor first because I feel like I'm going to ramble and have a tirade, but more like thought-provoking than whatever Mel Kiper spurted out earlier today. Alex, what's your take on this Bryce Young situation and his benching?
I don't think that it came too soon. Let's start there. I think something needed to be done. I think the stats speak for themselves. I mean, through 2 games, Bryce was, I have them written down here, 31 of 56, 245 passing yards, 3 interceptions, no touchdowns, a total quarterback rating of 9.1, which that's
a QBR. That's not his passer rating, just to clarify.
Okay, wait, this is actually a good time to clarify this. Mike, what is the distinction for those? I mean, I know what it is clearly, but what is the distinction?
A passer rating is the traditional passer rating that a player gets because of their completion percentage and all that stuff. A QBR factors in other analytics.
Okay. Still, 9.1, you never want to see a single digit.
Yeah.
That's not good. But if you're watching these games, you know those stats somehow don't capture his start. The offense that he's leading is bereft of life. I remember it clearly in the press box, there was one series toward the beginning of the game and they had gone through a couple 3-and-outs, and I audibly said, here comes 2 decent rushes up the middle and then a 3rd down incompletion. And it happened. It was one of 4 straight 3-and-outs that the Panthers started the game off with on Sunday against the Chargers. The 5th drive wasn't a 3-and-out because it only lasted 2 plays. One, a 10-yard run by Chuba Hubbard that was really quite impressive. And then the Panthers decided to go empty immediately after, and then Bryce throws an interception over the middle of the field. So that broke the 3-and-out streak, but it wasn't good, obviously. I don't think we need to illustrate that Bryce isn't playing well right now. I think when we answer the question, is Bryce being benched too soon? Is this move too soon? We need to consider 2 questions. And the first one is the season still salvageable? And what does salvageable mean? I don't think it ever meant playoffs. If you talk to the general manager, if you talk to the executive vice president of football operations, playoffs weren't the expectation. They even shied away from the word expectation. And you're 0-2 now. Since 2019, 0-2 teams have a 4.9 chance of making the playoffs. That's tiny, but the playoffs weren't the expectations for Carolina anyway. Another relevant stat via Bet Carolina. Since 2018, statistics show that the backup quarterback rarely plays better and rarely wins more than the starter does. The average starting win-loss difference is plus 0.022. and the average percentage pass completion difference is plus 2.75%. So that's all to say that having Andy Dalton in the backfield it is statistically unlikely that he will make this team a lot better. It is statistically unlikely that this season is salvageable when it comes to the playoffs. However, the playoffs aren't what the Panthers are using as a barometer for what makes the season good. How I consider whether this season is salvageable or not, the metrics that I would use are, did the team get better? Was there notable improvement on offense? Could they collect more data on Jonathan Mingo, on Xavier Legette, their first-round draft pick, who, by the way, wasn't targeted last week? Could the defense actually be good without constantly having to be on the field? And they were actually quite good on Sunday for a while until they eventually broke down because the Chargers' offensive rushing attack was so good, and they're built to break down barriers like this. So that's the first question. Is the season still salvageable? I think considering the metrics of could this offense get better at this time? Yes. The second question, is Bryce still salvageable? And I'd love to hear your thoughts more on this, and I think that's probably where you're going to go with this. But is Bryce Young the number 1 overall pick in 2023? Is there a plan for him to get better in his time on the sideline? The one last thing I'll say about the only thing that I'll say about this before tossing to you is I had a friend of mine leave me a very long voice memo after the game. I'm sure a lot of people hit you up after the game too, but this guy's a huge Alabama fan, not necessarily a big Panthers fan, but a huge Alabama fan. And he contends that Bryce Young is the greatest quarterback to ever put on an Alabama uniform. But he's watched every snap that he's played in the NFL, and he doesn't recognize him. And I think that has a lot to do with confidence. You know what confidence can do to players in the NFL. You see it in Mac Jones. You saw it with Sam Darnold and Baker Mayfield, and you saw what happens when confidence gets infused back in them. Bryce Young doesn't have confidence right now. And as Robert Hunt said after the Chargers game, when you lose confidence in this league, it's very hard to get it back. He doesn't wish that on anyone. And so something had to be done. And I think that this is an adequate thing to consider, considering the badness of this first part of the season. I know I ran a little bit longer than you were expecting, but I think I needed to address those two questions. Mike, I'm going to give you the floor. Do you think this Bryce Young benching has come too soon?
In a cylinder, no. I mean, if you were just like, let's forget his draft status, let's forget that he's playing for a first-year head coach, let's forget all that stuff. Based on his play, absolutely. You couldn't evaluate anything here. But what I will say is this is the latest in a long line of mishandlings of this quarterback situation. And look, Sam Darnold's having a great resurgence in Minnesota. Baker Mayfield continues his resurgence in Tampa Bay. Let's throw that all out. Let's talk about Bryce Young, okay? Bryce Young was considered an outlier. He was considered a small quarterback who was phenomenal at the college level. You draft him. The theory was, at least from my perspective, that he was able to improvise and move around the pocket and make plays that other quarterbacks couldn't because of his processing speed, his elusiveness, and his accuracy. He also has a high release, which you thought could maybe help him overcome his size deficiencies. The league loved Bryce Young. There were multiple teams that wanted to draft him and trade up to draft him number 1. That is a fact.
Absolutely.
But the Panthers were the ones that pulled that trigger. They decided on him above CJ Stroud. I'm more of a pocket passer guy. I'm a traditionalist. Carson Palmer, in my opinion, is the best prospect of all time. So I very much like CJ Stroud. That said, I completely understood the draw of drafting Bryce Young first overall. They bring him into an offense that's trying to figure itself out despite having a ton of veteran coaches on the staff. They then fire that coach. Let me rewind. They sign possibly the best bridge quarterback you could possibly hire in Andy Dalton. a guy who could start several games and allow Bryce Young to learn the NFL, allow the offense to figure out the system, allow this like concoction of terribleness that was established be, presented with a veteran quarterback who knows the offense, who knows Josh McCown, who knows Frank Reich, who understands offenses, has seen everything. They chose not to do that. Instead, they subjected Bryce Young to week 1 and week 2. He looked mediocre at best. He gets injured. The severity of that injury, I think you could speculate on after week 3. Dalton goes out and has a pretty solid game. I think people are misremembering. It wasn't like the greatest performance ever. It wasn't exponentially better. Yeah, his passing yardage looked great, but they lost, and he was trying to get them back into the game. So then what do? The next week they put Bryce Young back in. Bryce goes on a string of okay to mediocre games until they get to week 15. He looks great against the Green Bay Packers and hasn't thrown a touchdown since. But we got to rewind a little bit again. So Frank Reich's out. They've fired the head coach. They've shuffled offensive coordinators during his rookie season. They bring in a coach who hires an offensive staff that he is very familiar with. They're all on the same page. They all speak the same thing. They all speak the same language. Bryce gets all of the OTA starter reps. Then Andy Dalton gets hurt early in training camp. Bryce Young gets all the reps there. He starts to build. He starts to become a very good practice player throughout training camp. The last 2 weeks of training camp, he was really, really strong, playing against his own defense and then playing against the Jets. They don't play him in the preseason, even though it's a new system. I think the preseason argument's kind of a paper tiger, kind of a straw man, because he ends up playing a full game against the Saints and struggles mightily. Oh, so he's got more playing time than he ever would have gotten in the preseason, and then struggled mightily against the Chargers. Anyway, back up again. So he plays against a bunch of guys who probably are not on the Bills anymore. In the preseason finale, plays one drive, looks excellent. They put him out there against New Orleans. He's terrible. He doesn't complete a pass until they're already down by 17. So he's already playing from behind. He has trouble reading blitz pressure packages. He then claims that he has the ability to change certain things and has freedom. Dave Canales backs him. Then he comes in this Chargers game and looks somehow even worse. They've called a play calling adventure, as I would call it, where most of the reads were short yardage, trying to get his confidence up. Inevitably, it hurts him because the defense keys in on that, and he just basically gets plastered around the field with incompletions, hits, sacks. Like, it didn't work. He didn't work. And look, the sum of the parts is, as I ramble about this, is all mismanagement. There was literally no reason to start Bryce Young right away as a rookie. I said that when he was drafted. I said Andy Dalton was a perfect guy for that. They ignored it, rushed the guy out, just like a lot of teams do, and the hit rate on those guys typically isn't great. They've changed up his offense 3 separate times. They've asked him to do a bunch of stuff. Look, the physical inadequacies are very clear, and his performance has been terrible. You're drafted first overall. You're expected to uplift your teammates, not have your teammates uplift you all the time. But I think the thing that really sticks out to me here is 2 things can be true. The Panthers failed Bryce Young with how they've handled him over the last 18 months. Fact. That is a fact. You drafted him. You made him your guy. You pushed him out there. You put the immediate pressure on him when you didn't need to. You saw him struggle throughout the year. Then you doubled down by hiring a head coach who you thought could fix him because of his work with quarterbacks. He still fails, and then the onus is put on him. When the defense can't stop anyone, despite having all of these guys that are familiar with the system, they're running into each other. The punter's punting 6 times a game. The wide receivers are struggling to get yards after the catch. Like, the only thing that's really been fixed is the offensive line, which I think has performed very, very well over the last years.
Yeah.
The running game is playing as well as you and I have talked about. I thought the running game would be a strength of this team. Dave Canales thought that too. And then you're going back on Bryce Young. Yes, two things can be true. The Panthers failed Bryce Young, but Bryce Young failed to operate in this offense. And when you fail to operate as a quarterback at the magnitude that he did, you can't evaluate anyone. You can't evaluate Xavier Legette. You can't evaluate Jonathan Mingo. You can't evaluate Tommy Tremble. You can't, with no hope for getting points, you can't evaluate the defense. The defense has very little margin for error. Special teams has very little margin for error. Getting a kickoff and returning it to the 20 is going to be seen as a negative because they can't pick up yardage on offense because the quarterback can't throw.
Yep.
I think this benching was necessary. I thought it would originally be – I thought he was going to get this week. I truly thought he was going to get this week. I thought week 4 through 6 were the times to pull the plug if you needed to, because you spent the entire offseason building around this guy. Think about how many wasted reps that is in turn. And they're trying to build a culture. The reason why I'm okay with this benching is I'll read this quote from Adam Thielen. Adam Thielen had kind of a tirade in the middle of the 26-3 loss against the Chargers. He was wide open. Instead, Bryce Young took a sack. He started screaming to himself on the sideline and pacing. We asked him about it. He admitted to it. He said it was immature. I asked him how he keeps Bryce Young from being discouraged. He says, I think, number one, I went over and I apologized to him because it wasn't, again, directed at anyone. But when you do that, it feels probably like it's directed at someone. I don't know how he felt about it, but again, take accountability. I apologize. I can't do that. I can't let my cool down. We talk through games. We talk during the week. He's a great kid. I love that guy, and I'm fighting for him. I'm fighting for him. I'm fighting for all my teammates. Again, when you put so much into this game, and I know that I don't have a lot of time left, you feel that, and you feel that, and you put it all out there every single day in practice, in games. You just want to see some results as an offense, as a team, because I know these guys. We fought together. We have the guys. We just have to figure it out. And a few things strike me there. This team is actually one of the older teams in the league because of the contracts they've held on to. The specialists are both older. Adams, obviously older. Dalton's older, all that stuff. When he's saying he puts a lot into the game, which he does, we know he works really hard. There's guys like Jordan Matthews who work really hard to be here, all that stuff. You can't look at a locker room as a head coach and say, look, there's this very clear weakness here. I'm trying to build a culture here, and I'm just going to continue to give him the scholarship. The scholarship is gone. That's what this all means. Doesn't mean we won't see Bryce Young again. Doesn't mean that Bryce Young should be traded, although it wouldn't shock me if those close to him thought he should be traded because of the way this was kind of sprung. I'm not reporting that. That's just speculation. I want to make that very clear. But, that's normally how a lot of these situations end. But we also haven't seen a situation like this where our first overall pick was benched after 18 games. I mean, Jamarcus Russell was rough, but he got his time. Like, this is tough.
So Mike, this kind of dovetails into my question for you that's coming up. We're talking about this like there's some finality to it. I think some fans are still out there thinking, okay, well, this is a time when Bryce can learn from the sideline where, yes, this might be belated, but this could be Andy's time to be that bridge quarterback for Bryce. And he can learn and he can eventually grow into he can get his confidence back and he eventually can grow into this creative passer. And I see how you're already kind of moving. I am curious to hear your thoughts. Is this just a stepping stone in the Bryce Young story, or is there a legitimate finality to this? Like, I know we asked Dave Canales yesterday, or you did specifically, if Andy's just going to be the starter going forward, or is there like a timeline to when they want Bryce to get back into the season? Is Bryce going to start again? And he very much stuck to the company line of Andy gives us the best chance to win right now. That all said, is this a final point in the Bryce Young Carolina Panthers story?
I could see how Dave Canales could see this as being a positive for Bryce, as he basically worked with the two guys who have, in recent memory, who have overcome being benched as a high pick or a starting quarterback in their very early youth in the NFL, and Baker Mayfield and Geno Smith, and turning it around and doing that stuff. But to be honest, like, I don't know how you look at the situation with rose-colored glasses. As you said, what Robert Hunt said, it's hard to gain your confidence back. His physical shortcomings are not going away. The thing is, when you're a backup quarterback, you're playing with the scout team, and that's your practice reps. So you're studying other quarterbacks and trying to mimic what they do and mimic other systems. And maybe, you know what? Maybe that extra flavor will help him, as I wrote in my mailbag today. But it's hard to take a positive spin on this. This is an organizational failure, like to the umpth degree. And I don't know, man. I just think there's so much pressure put on these quarterbacks early, and a lot of them are rushed out there. Some sink, some swim. But I think when you prolong the amount of time that they have to tread water in garbage water, it just makes it worse. Like, had they benched him mid-year last year, maybe it would have been more salvageable, or maybe if they would have started the season and said, you know what, we're going to make Bryce earn it. And Andy was the starter for 3 weeks, then I'd get it. But like pulling the curtain this quickly and doing this, like, I understand you have to worry about the locker room. You can't just worry about one player. And look, to their credit, this was a brave move by this brain trust. This took a lot of courage. They knew they were going to get slammed. They knew that they had to make a decision. They knew they couldn't lose the locker room, which I think is an asinine term in general, because no one ever fully loses everybody in a locker room. Everybody has their own priorities and stuff like that. But this early in Dave Canales' tenure, as he's trying to establish his culture with Brad Idzik, with Idro Evero, with Scott Cooper, with Dan Morgan at the helm, like, they had to make some tough decisions. And I know a lot of people are jumping to, this has Tepper written all over it. I mean, it's a major decision, right?
Yeah,
and look, to be fair, this puts egg on David Tepper's face. David Tepper wanted Bryce Young. There's no, like, nothing happens this big without an owner signing off, whether it's the Panthers, whether it's the Eagles, whether it's, well, maybe not the White Sox, but you know what I'm saying?
No,
like,
why you gotta do that?
Like, here's the thing, like, an owner is
my dad's a huge White Sox fan. Is a huge White Sox fan, for all the listeners out there who just completely missed that stray that Mike just tossed at me, but at the Zetlo name. But go on.
But the White Sox are propping the Panthers up right now, to be honest with you. And look, I think they're trying to establish this for the long term. If you're riding onto a guy who's clearly a sore thumb, you can't establish that culture. There's too many older guys in there. They brought in all of these older defensive players. Like, at some point, you have to be able to establish what Dave Canales can do. And Bryce Young clearly couldn't do what Dave Canales was asking him to do, whether that was his fault or Dave Canales' fault. And so they had to have a very serious conversation. Like, this is something that, like, look, Dave Canales the day before said that Bryce was our quarterback. He has to live with the fact that publicly he looks like he contradicted himself. The whole I went home and had an epiphany thing, sounds like a really good line, I guess, internally. But, like, to me, that's a bigger decision to make than, I watched the tape and, this didn't work. I mean, last week we clearly saw it didn't work, right? And then he comes into here and he somehow plays worse. I just think this failure is not totally on Dave Canales. This is a failure that's brewed over 18 months. I think Dave Canales, based on the play calling I saw in training camp, can have an effective offense. We'll see if that works with Andy Dalton. I'm wondering if we're going to hear any but Andy Dalton didn't play in the preseason stuff. And then he goes out and he throws for 300 yards.
Mike, but since we're on the topic of Dave Canales, you said that this took a lot of courage. We cannot overstate the fact that Dave was brought in, no matter what the quotes say, no matter what he says, Dave was brought in to rectify all of the issues associated with Bryce Young in his rookie
100%.
year. That was his goal. That was his job. In his introductory press conference, he was raving about how great Bryce's game is, about how creative he is, about how smart he is, about all he was that. There was an anecdote where he, during an interview with Dan Morgan and all the decision makers of who they were going to choose as their next head coach, where Dave was literally going through film with them and being like, hey, this is how excited, this is what I can do with your quarterback. This is how excited I am about that. And Dave in his introductory press conference said, he is the guy. He is a face of the franchise type player, which, is par for the course for these like joyful kind of moments in franchise, history. But like, it still was, I believe in him and he is my way to establishing myself as a head coach. We cannot overstate how like big of a deal it is that Dave pulled the plug on this so early and he benched Bryce so early, because he was brought in to uplift him. And
yeah, he was a double down. He was a double down move.
Absolutely. And so that is a very important thing to consider in all of this. I mean, it could not, like, if there was any avoiding this, Dave probably would have avoided it. I just think that's an important thing to like remember in all this, because anyway, I feel like I had another point to make, but it's eluding me right now. But I feel like you have something to say on this too. Well, what I was going to say is, Mike you and I talked about this off air after the game, or after Los Angeles. We were like, if Dave does this, he is changing the rubric on how he's graded in his first year, because how he's graded in his first year was largely about how good Bryce Young could be. It wasn't about team success necessarily. It wasn't about offensive success as a whole. A lot of it was how Bryce Young was doing. So he's changing the rubric, and now it's like a bigger gamble than I think most people consider. So that's why I think this is so surprising. Anyway, do you have anything to add on that? I mean, I kind of rambled for a second.
Yeah, I always like to bring up the quote, people will remember how you make them feel, right?
Yep.
And this organization has done a really good job of establishing this isn't all about Bryce, but also saying there are no expectations. And so I think when you go into a season like that and then immediately say Bryce is the problem, that is what benching him is. I'm sorry, that is what you are saying with your actions. It concerns me that words might not have meaning. And as two writers, we know that not to be true.
Yep.
But for a coach, you want to make sure that your words mean something. And so while I think there will be some guys in the locker room who are going to be excited to get a pass beyond 17 yards, I also think there are people that have been around Bryce for a while and who believe in his strength and potentially his upside, that are going to say, well, what's next, right? And so you don't want to see a snowball. If they go to Las Vegas and get trucked, and Andy, yeah, he looks more confident, but they're just, inept. Like, what then, right?
Well, I think a lot of Panthers fans will respond by saying, okay, that's fine. Let's cut our losses, move on to a good draft position in the coming year and try to rebuild from there. And I don't agree with it, man. It's you're 2 weeks into the year. You got to find a way to make the season salvageable one way or the other.
The season isn't salvageable. It isn't. I'm sorry. It's not. There's
not salvageable using the metrics of playoffs.
No,
you got to find a way to improve.
Let me ask you this. What does winning 5 or 6 games with Andy Dalton truly do, other than keep the locker room intact? What does it truly do? Here's what I'm asking. The one way that this is salvageable is if the offense looks explosive under Dave Canales. regardless, right?
Mhm.
Like that's what's salvageable.
Explosive is a very good. I think that we should use a word like competent or something.
But see, like that's my point. Is like we keep giving everybody mulligans and these low standards, but you've benched the starting quarterback who you've invested all of this stuff. And yes, I understand Dave Canales was not here. Dan Morgan wasn't the final vote here. But like, it's ridiculous to me that you are still selling low standards when you bench the guy who you spent an entire offseason working around. He was terrible. I'm not saying the messaging needs to now change, is my point. Like if this all becomes about just establishing who Dave Canales is as an offensive play caller, fine. That's the benchmark, right? Right? I mean, like that's literally what you're saying is salvageable, because this team has constantly, not just this year, but other years, has said things and done differently, and they have not mattered. They have not. They're constantly moving the goalposts here. If you are saying that the way that this is salvageable is the offense is maybe a top 15 offense under this young play caller who thought, highly of what he could do enough to be the head coach, the offensive coordinator, and the quarterback's coach. By the way, the main focus of all three of those positions has failed in 2 weeks. What are you trying to accomplish here? Because, Andy Dalton can read defenses. He understands how to play in the league. We know that already. What is salvageable here? Are you saying, like, if he can make it look like Deontay Johnson and Xavier Legette and all these guys are really productive, cool. Is Chuba Hubbard
that is part of my answer, for real.
Well, is Chuba Hubbard running for 1,000? Cool. I expected him to run for 1,000 yards anyway. I just think, like, we can't constantly move the goalposts here. There has to be some sort of accountability, and this is the first real shot at, like, hey, this was, an abject failure the first 2 weeks.
Just the thing that drives me crazy about sports in general, but about, like, this particular situation is if the Panthers don't have everything figured out, if they don't have a path to the playoffs, hell, if they don't have a path to the Super Bowl, then everything is a waste.
Why is that different than Bryce Young's situation?
No. What I'm saying is like, if there's no path to the Super Bowl, then it is deemed useless. Then we should
I don't think
just throw everything out. Well, no. I know that's not what you're saying, but I'm articulating how a lot of people feel, and a lot of people think, okay, well, Bryce Young's ceiling, if he was scouted properly, gives this team the best chance to be whatever. At some point, you got to give the fans something to, like, cheer about. At some point, there's got to be belief. At some point, there's got to be like, okay, well, if the offense is working, at least the defense is working. If at least the special teams are good. If there's got to be something positive you can take from it. And, like, I've sat through 18 games of Bryce Young's career, and, like, yes, the Packers game was good. Of course, the Packers' secondary got gashed the week before by Baker Mayfield and effectively paved the way for him getting a huge extension in Tampa Bay. But whatever. Like, if there is no positive, then, like, you're dwelling in irrelevance. I'm
not saying there isn't a positive. What I'm saying is this. If you are going from saying this is a young coach, it's a retooling, whatever you want to call it, and you want to establish the offense, the reason why he was hired is to make this offense better, which in turn make Bryce Young better. You winning with a 36-year-old quarterback, what does that do for the future other than establish that you are a good play caller? If that's the goal, if that's now the goal, if that's the whole goal of the season, because the defense can't figure anything out, despite having a tenured defensive coordinator and a bunch of familiar faces. If that's what you are saying, fine, cool. That's the positive. But I also think it's moving the goalpost. I really do. I think it's moving the goalpost.
It certainly is.
It's par for the course with this franchise. And look, I'm trying to stay objective here, but, like, realistically, there's a reason why fans are so impatient. It's because the goalposts always move, and decisions that would normally be seen as rational seem to not pan out for one reason or another because goalposts are moving. This is not a Dan Morgan problem. This is not a Dave Canales problem. This is a problem that's happened for the last several years under David Tepper's ownership. Whether he is the root cause of all of that, whatever. But the reality of the situation is his ownership tenure has not panned out very well.
Yeah.
Largely because the goalposts move all the time.
Bro,
whether he's involved or not.
I just can't imagine you spend so much money, not even to be a PSL owner. You spend so much money to be one of a half-filled stadium, a Bank of America Stadium. It's a gorgeous day. You're spending $30 on nachos, $10 on a beer. You figure out ways to pay for $50 worth of parking in Uptown. And I cannot imagine you have fun watching the Panthers on Sunday.
Definitely not looking at your receipts on your
in that Chargers game. Well, I'm just saying, like, there's got to be a way to not constantly balance the future with, like, to not constantly how you say, like, the present has to be tolerable. It just does. That's what or else you risk losing your fan base. You risk losing your support. And yeah, sure, they'll come back when the future is good, but that's not how it works. The present has to be tolerable. That's all I'm saying.
I mean, I think upside is hope, right? Like that's
what. But they've been selling hope for so long, man. Like it's falling on deaf ears.
Right. I mean, you also have to be a little like self-aware, right? Like, I mean, I don't think either one of us was like, yeah, this team's gonna like. I picked them to have 6 wins. You picked them to have 5 wins. So an average of 5.5 between the two guys that are there every single day.
Right.
Yeah. That doesn't scream hope. It screams like, okay, cool. This is a building block. This is not the ceiling. And right now, what you're doing is, yes, you are raising the floor. You are raising the floor. You have a stepping stool at the podium now. I'm gonna let that.
I was about to say, bro.
Yeah, just let it go. You're raising the floor, but I don't know how much you're raising the ceiling. And the thing is, Andy Dalton's my age. He's in fact older than me by a few months. Like, if he does well, like Joe Flacco was comeback player of the year last year at 38. He's now a backup again in Indianapolis. Like, it's just like, what do? Maybe you say to yourself, well, the upside is now we know that if they have a veteran quarterback running the show, we can sign the guy to a big money deal and he can operate in it. But I also think like part of the reason to hire a young coach was to kind of bring in that youthful energy and get those youthful parts up to task. Look, here's what I will say, because we're already almost doubled our normal allotment, and we're going to keep going. Zach, I hope you have like a cushion on that chair, because we're going to keep going. This is going to be a
Zach's doing great, baby. Zach's doing great.
Of course he's doing great. He's Zach, and he's listening to me talk. But speaking of Andy Dalton, what would be like the positive? Like, what do you want to see from Andy Dalton to say that this makes sense? Like immediate return on the investment of embarrassment, because that's what it is, right? Like, this was an embarrassing decision that took courage, like, and you had to kind of grit it, right? It's almost like holding on to contracts that are terrible for the salary cap so that you can get a free release next year. What do you think would be a positive outcome for Andy Dalton, who, in my opinion, is being evaluated on a week-to-week basis?
A third down completion. A couple.
Well, Bryce got, I think, one of those to Adam Thielen in week 1.
Okay. I was being snarky right there.
You're like you're like a substitute teacher who comes in and is like, yeah, man, we're gonna learn a lot today, and then you just turn on like a PBS TV
what
movie.
You mean? Hey.
That's the lesson. Like that's what that is.
I mean, I don't exactly know. I guess part of my reason for the snark is I don't exactly know how to answer this question because like what makes
you don't have expectations.
Well, I do have expectations. I think Andy Dalton will win this team some games. I think he'll keep the defense on the sideline. But here's where I'm operating from. I'm operating from making this team watchable, and I think Andy Dalton has a higher potential to do that right now, purely because Bryce's confidence is gone. I know
I will
that.
tell you, we get like an unusual amount of tweets and texts that say, "I feel bad for you that you have to watch this." Listen,
Yes.
don't feel bad for Alex. Don't feel bad for me. We get to hang out with each other, two of our respective close friends,
Yep.
and pay to get to watch football. Alex has a wonderful family. I have a wonderful family.
No,
And
totally. But
keep perspective here. All right, guys. We're
no,
doing
yes.
okay, I promise. We also love working for the CharlotteObserver.com.
And working alongside Zach Dennis.
Yeah, Zach. Zach Dennis. I come in to that launch factory, and that dude just brightens my day. Anyway, I'll let you.
I get to report in the locker room with Jadeveon Clowney drink. That's pretty cool. But anyway, I just think this offense is going to be watchable, and I think they're going to be able to string together a couple drives, score some points. I really do think that because it just can't get much worse. And like I said, after week 1, I think the play calling in week 2 wasn't as great. There was a graphic that showed that Bryce didn't throw the ball over 15 yards or something like that. I think you referenced it earlier in the show. So that's not good, but like there's clearly some creativity lodged in there. The interior offensive line is graded out real well. Really, the entire offensive line is graded out real well. The 2 sacks that Bryce took in week 2 were like kind of his fault. He needed to step up in the pocket when Joey Bosa sacked him, and that's when Adam Thielen had his boiling over moment on the sideline. He was just screaming.
The other one, he just froze to the left sideline after rolling down.
And the other one, exactly like you said, he was rolling to his left, and if he throws the ball away, you salvage a field goal. If he throws the ball downfield, you might get a first down or an incompletion. If he runs for it, like you were saying in the press box, that's a first down.
If he literally does anything, it's a positive play. Literally does anything else.
I just think that those mistakes are going to be limited. And also, like, if Bryce gets, like, kind of gain some confidence from this, that might be good too. But if you're asking me, like, what, like, specific metrics I expect to see with Andy at the helm, again, I don't think that this changes the team's, like, record outlook necessarily. Statistically, it doesn't, as I explained earlier in the show. But it'll just be like relatively enjoyable to watch. I don't know, man. Do you have specific metrics? Because then maybe
I'm going to talk the football part of this. I think Dave Canales is going to come out with the best game plan he's ever had. I really do. I think there's going to be zone beaters. There's going to be man beaters. I think he's going to use rub routes. I think he's going to use concepts that he hasn't brought out yet. I think he's going to be very creative here because really the spotlight's now on him. He does not have, we talked about it last year when, Frank Reich could give up play calling and then he took it back, right? That was like his one card, get out of jail free card. And I think, again, it was a brave decision because now the spotlight is on him. I think Canales is going to try to spread the ball around. I think they're going to try to get Xavier Legette on some jump balls. I think they're going to have Jonathan Mingo go downfield. I don't think you're going to see a ton of behind the line trickery because I think a lot of that was to cover up for Bryce's inadequacies. I think they'll be creative in a way that they can take advantage of coverage. Patrick Graham's a really good defensive coordinator. So having Andy Dalton back there, it might give them a leg up a little bit. On paper, I thought this was the game that they could really steal on the road. Now I'm not as sure, but Andy Dalton certainly, I agree with Dave Canales. I think Andy Dalton does give them a better chance to win this week. And, Andy's former team, the Bengals, is waiting. And then his former team, the Bears, are waiting. So that's kind of interesting. This next 3-game stretch should be very, very interesting. But I do think, look, I think Canales is a sharp guy. I really do. I think the jury's still out on him as a head coach, but I think as an offensive mind, he is creative. I think Brad is creative. And I think this will be a good showcase for them.
Yep.
I think the idea to bench Bryce was, what the schedule looks like after week 7 or really week 8. And so this 5-game stretch you really have to take advantage of if you want to show any sort of upside as a play caller.
Yep, absolutely.
And so
look, you want to talk? Sorry, go.
Let's talk about the Raiders a little bit. They have Gardner Minshew. I covered him in Philly when he was a backup. He arrived in Jacksonville right after I left. Zany guy, really good. Like,
hey, he's North Carolina's own too as a ECU alum. So,
well, he's been everywhere, man. He was at Washington State. He was, but he's a guy who can beat you if you make mistakes. He's not a guy who's going to elevate the talent around him. He's just not that guy. He doesn't have that arm. He doesn't have the size. He can do a lot of stuff. He's kind of what you would hope that Bryce Young's floor would be, drafting him first overall. Like, he's an adequate player. He protects the ball relatively well. He can make throws when he needs to. He's not particularly I wouldn't say there's anything dynamic about him, but I do think he is a guy who can beat you if you make mistakes. And this Panthers defense has made a lot of mistakes. And so I think that's the concern. I mean, Zaire White's a really good runner. I think, their running game has been solid enough. But the reality is the Panthers can't beat themselves. And that's what they've been doing the last 2 weeks. And if they don't, they've got a shot. But the Raiders did just beat the Ravens, who were gotten off to a rough start. And the Ravens are way more talented than the Panthers are on paper. So this needs to be, and they're going to be on the road. So this needs to be a really well-called game for Dave Canales.
I mean, it seems like, just looking over the defensive stats that the Raiders have, it seems like there's that possibility. They give up 22.5 points a game, which is 19th in the league. They give up 349.5 yards a game, which is 23rd in the league. Opponents score more often than not, score touchdowns more often than not in the red zone at 57%. They're a
middling club. That's what they are.
Yes. The one interesting stat that's popping out is their opponent's third down conversion percentage is only 27%, which is top 10 in the league. So that's fascinating. That could just be an aberration, though, through 2 weeks.
Well, Alex, let me give you an analytical mind quote.
Okay.
Good teams don't get to third down.
Yeah, that's fair.
But that's the thing. That's how you beat the Raiders. Is good teams don't have to get to third down constantly. So if you're making big plays for 10 to 12 yards in the passing game and you are running the ball effectively on first down, you can avoid that percentage. That's part of the thing. Like, remember, the Panthers had like a really, really good percentage on third down. The problem was they weren't seeing a lot of third down.
It needed context. Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Yes.
So, and context is key. I think the context of this whole Bryce Young benching needs to be said. I mean, look, again, Bryce Young did himself no favors with his play. I don't think this is all on him. I think the organization let him down. I also think that Andy Dalton truly does give them a better chance to win this week by default. Like, the bar is so low. I won't say what franchise this is, but I remember going to a training camp once when I was covering the entire league, and the standard was, can we just get adequate quarterback play? And so, like, I think that's a really low bar, and it's moving the goalposts. But again, par for the course. And listen, like, I'm not here to speculate on who had the final say on this decision. Dave Canales very clearly talked to Dan Morgan and Brent Tillis and David Tepper, and he wanted to keep that stuff private. I can respect that. But what I will say is the pressure falls immediately on the shoulders of Dave Canales, and he needs to respond, and his guys need to respond. Because if he did this for the locker room needs to step up. Because frankly, there are guys who have played close to the level of Bryce Young over the last 2 weeks, and they're probably not getting benched.
Yeah.
They just cut. They reportedly are cutting Iku Leota, who led the team in sacks. I get it. One sack that was basically a failed scramble for -1 yard. I get it, but like he was here all summer. They cut 2 guys.
And he played well all summer too.
They cut 2 guys straight off of waivers to cut other guys on their team. Shutter Islands in Los Angeles. Jamie Sheriff's back in Seattle. Keenan Isaacs in Tampa Bay. I believe Deshaun Jameson just signed with Pittsburgh. Amir Smith-Marset signed with the Giants. There's one thing to churn the bottom of the roster. Like they're pulling the old Chuba Hubbard. They're churning, and also just making moves for the sake of moves. I hope that by the time this podcast runs, that they've made a corresponding move that's interesting and worthwhile. But, if you're trying to make an example, there are guys in much higher positions who have been much less productive that you could probably figure out with your blind eye. We won't go through the list because there's quite a few of them. And one of the things that we said going into training camp is they've got a solid first team. After that, it's rough. So in one aspect, I understand a lot of the roster flip-flopping. On the other hand, if I were in that locker room, I'd be like, am I next? And that can be a good thing. It could also be a bad thing for culture when you feel like you're not getting time to shine, or you're not getting enough time to prove yourself.
This is not going to be the last that we talk about the Bryce Young dilemma. This is not going to be the last time we talk about if Andy Dalton is going to be the guy of the future. But I think we hammered it pretty home for a first crack at the bat. Bryce
why don't you? There was a lot less humor in this episode, and I'm sorry because we went double like the normal time. I'll make it up to you guys. I'm sick, so I'm in somewhat of a rough mood.
We had a lot to get through. I feel like people will find the humor. I mean, we did low-key kind of fight in the middle too.
The passion was all about you and me, like us getting into an argument. I mean, I think, look, you and I cover this team as objectively as possible. We watch all this stuff. At the end of the day, we're just watching this, right? Mm-hmm. Like we're watching this thing go down the tracks. And
we're more than watching. We're in the locker room with these guys. We're hearing these stories. We're having conversations that the public doesn't see and stuff like that.
Right, but we are spectators. And the fans are who this matters to, right? And I think part of the reason why I infuse so much humor in my writing, why you put so much character into yours, is because, look, we know we're watching the same thing you are. This is rough. And I think you guys sticking with us and reading our content and listening to our content and doing all that stuff matters a lot to us. We really appreciate being in your ears right now. And we hope you stick with us throughout the season because we're going to be around for a while. So on that note, Alex.
Thanks as always for listening to our pontifications on all things Panthers with Mike K and myself and our wonderful producer, Zach Dennis. Please subscribe and follow us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts by searching Processing Blue. And if you watch us on YouTube, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click on the bell icon to get notified whenever new episodes drop. And finally, please be sure to stick to charlotteobserver.com for all your Panthers needs. Stay humble, stay creative, and keep processing.
That's a wrap.